President, this amendment ensures that in implementing the new authorities provided in this bill, the government is acquiring the communications of targets in whom it has some foreign intelligence interest and is not conducting bulk collection of all communications between the United States and overseas. And yes, this amendment was also approved by the Judiciary Committee. This amendment is necessary because of the vast and overbroad authorities provided by the PAA and this bill. In public testimony, the DNI stated that the PAA would authorize the bulk collection of all communications between the United States and overseas. Now, that could cover every communication between Americans inside the United States and Europe or South America or the entire world. It could also include communications between Americans overseas and their family and friends back home. Mr. President, this bill is understood to allow the warrantless targeting of a terrorist suspect overseas, even when that person is communicating with an American at home. The bill does not simply apply to terrorist suspects, however. It permits warrantless collection of communications between law-abiding Americans and people overseas who are not suspected of doing anything wrong at all. Now, that is a problem that needs to be addressed. But this bill does not just allow the targeting of conversations of people who are not suspected of any wrongdoing. This bill actually allows the government to capture all international communications to or from the United States in bulk for no good reason. I think it's safe to say that no one in this country expects that all of their international communications can be collected by the government. That kind of communications dragnet would offend anyone who has ever communicated with friends, family, or professional associates in other countries. It raises serious constitutional questions. It would completely overwhelm the already inadequate minimization procedures that are the only bump in the road to completely uncontrolled dissemination of information about Americans, and there would be no court oversight whatsoever. Mr. President, bulk collection poses yet another serious constitutional danger. By collecting all international communications, the government would be collecting communications between Americans overseas and their friends and family back home. Senator Wyden and White House and I have fought hard to ensure that Americans overseas cannot be intentionally targeted without a warrant, but bulk collection is a backdoor way to conduct the same warrantless wiretapping. Imagine the number of Americans' communications, not with foreigners, but with other Americans, Mr. President, with other Americans that would be acquired by the government through bulk collection of, say, communications between the United States and Britain. That means Americans studying and working abroad, tourists passing through, and even U.S. troops stationed there. Nothing would prevent their communications from being collected and retained. And nothing would prevent those communications from being disseminated so long as the government decided there was foreign intelligence value. I asked my colleagues, at what point do we draw the line? At what point does the Constitution mean something? Mr. President, I'm sure that some of my colleagues will say that we should just trust the government not to do this, not to abuse this. Yet the DNI has testified that while bulk collection is not needed, it, quote, would certainly be desirable if it was physically possible to do so, unquote. Mr. President, this is not a short-term piece of legislation, and it's not reassuring that the intelligence community cannot currently collect all international communications. This bill does not sunset for years, and what is technically possible in this area changes rapidly. Given the potential impact on the privacy and constitutional rights of Americans posed by bulk collection, Congress needs to act now. Now, the DNI has put us on notice that bulk collection is both authorized and, in his word, desirable. Legislative silence on this issue is consent. This body must take a position on this issue. Should the government be able to sweep up all international communications involving Americans at home and abroad or not? We can't avoid that question. The bill, combined with the DNI's comment, places it squarely before us. Mr. President, the amendment I have offered here is extremely modest. It merely requires the government to certify to the court that in using these broad new authorities to conduct warrantless surveillance, it is collecting the communications of foreign targets from whom it expects to obtain foreign intelligence information. The government doesn't have to explain its foreign intelligence interests to the court, doesn't even have to identify its targets. It merely has to say that an interest exists, and the court cannot challenge this certification. So, because this amendment is so modest, opponents have raised an absurd hypothetical argument against it. And this is what it is, that it would somehow prevent the collection of communications into or out of an enemy-occupied city that the U.S. military is about to invade. Now, this argument is plain silly. My amendment requires that there be a foreign intelligence purpose for collection. In this hypothetical posited by opponents of the amendment, any and all individuals in a city our troops are about to invade would clearly have foreign intelligence value. That is what distinguishes this case, in which the government can easily make the certification required by the amendment, and on the other hand, the bulk collection of all communications between, say, the United States and Europe. The reason that absurd scenarios like this have been raised as, quote, unforeseen consequences is that opponents of this amendment don't want to address the consequences of not passing it. The consequences of the government collecting all communications between the United States and Canada or Europe or South America. The consequences of millions of innocent Americans' communications being collected. The consequences of already inadequate minimization procedures being overwhelmed by the collection. And these aren't even unforeseen consequences. The DNI testified that if this were physically possible, bulk collection would certainly be desirable. The DNI envisions a country where the government, if it were technologically feasible, would listen in on every international phone call made by its citizens and read every international email. Now, that's a police state, Mr. President, not the United States of America. Mr. President, this amendment will help put to rest another concern that has been expressed about this legislation. In August, after the enactment of the PAA, the DNI stated, quote, now there's a sense that we're doing massive data mining. In fact, what we're doing is surgical. A telephone number is surgical. So if you know what number, you can select it out, unquote. And the DNI then added, quote, we've got a lot of territory to make up with people believing that we're doing things we're not doing, unquote. Now, Mr. President, the best way to assure Americans that the government is not doing massive data mining of their international communications is to not to authorize the massive collection of their international communications. The DNI can't have it both ways. He can't complain that people believe the government is doing things it isn't doing and then oppose amendments to the law that would prohibit the government from doing those very same things, especially when he has also said that bulk collection would be, quote, desirable, unquote, if it were physically possible. Finally, my amendment would help resolve a serious constitutional question surrounding this bill. When Americans are on the line, the constitutionality of the surveillance depends in part on how it is conducted. Bulk collection of millions of Americans' communications in which the government has no interest in the person on the other end of the line could very well be unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. And we can eliminate this particular constitutional problem with the adoption of this very modest amendment. Mr. President, I challenge anyone who opposes this amendment to stand up on this floor and explain to the American people why the government should have the authority to engage in bulk collection of their private communications. Let's tell the American people the truth for once. Don't rely on hypothetical, unintended consequences that are easily answered. Explain why this very modest protection of the privacy of our citizens cannot be granted. Now, I believe this amendment brings this bill into line with its actual intent. It gives Congress a say in how far these vast new authorities will be taken, and it protects the civil liberties of Americans. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield the floor, and I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. President.